May I remind you of the next two speakers, Anne Lieslegar on March the 8th and Jonas Dahlberg on March the 22nd. The speaker this evening, as you know, is David Claerbout. I don't know where I was when I first saw something that I took to be a film. There was a ball in the air, and there were lots of people, and they moved around. There were adults, there were children. And then suddenly I realized the ball hadn't moved at all. And I couldn't work this out, but it has stuck in my mind for many, many years, and it still remains my favorite piece. You may have seen it in London. David Claerbout has said, photographs are films that keep their mouths shut. I think it's worth pondering that statement. His work, in some sense, lies between film and photographs. He subverts the time of the photograph, and he disrupts the movement of film. He produces his own kind of movement from the surface of still images. We think of the photograph as a still image, and we think of film as moving image. Film, of course, has its own notion of continuity, but Claerbout wants to reinvent the meaning of continuity. He would like three prints from three different times, before, now, and after, to be able to occupy the same surface, the same picture. He has a well-known work, it's the one I just described, Sections of a Happy Moment, in which a point in time and the course of time are woven into one, where he draws out a moment, one moment, for 26 minutes. The audience experiences a strange virtual movement, although time isn't really going by, in what Françoise Parfait has called an astonishing manufacture of the real. I realize that what I am saying is not entirely comprehensible. It seems unimaginable that one could invest the photograph with the future and deprive film of its here and now. I hope David Claerbout will say something about his use of the digital in unlocking the flow of time from a static situation. You may have seen the work I've been talking about. It has been in shows from Paris to San Francisco, and you may well have seen it in London at Hauser and Wirth in 2009 and at Parasol Unit last year. Currently, he's working on some new projects that use animation and 3D techniques, and I believe he will tell us more about this work this evening. Please welcome David.
Thank you. I have I'm rather soft-spoken, so give me a sign if this is not loud enough. And I should say maybe a few words about how I came to do what I do today, and that is by being an amateur and an autodidact. I taught myself most of the things that I practice today, and in fact I come from a rather conventional background. I ran academy for most of my young life, trained as a painter, lithographer, etching, and basically by the time when I was 22, 23, I was totally and utterly depressed with all the stuff that I had been doing since age 8, 9. I'd sort of had a feeling that I'd been running through everything, all the cycles that could be fed to young artists as examples of history, mainly in painting, and always felt I was running behind the facts. And so basically my student time is one full of frustration and with a profound sense of coming too late. And I think I got out of that at one point. Initially I stuck into it, and I actually became a master lithographer. I became somebody who does prints for other artists, but I was mainly working for myself. But the technique and the procedure related things that are surrounding graphics and traditional graphics were my thing. And I think I carried this kind of fascination for indirect working, not immediately seeing the result of the image, not immediately seeing the picture with me, and this suited me quite well when I started working with always new technologies, at least for me. And this is something that continues up to today, is that I'm always curious to find the things that are over the horizon, both technically, but I don't really make a distinction between a picture or a work and the way it's made. It's sort of one thing, it's one magical coincidence. On occasion it goes wrong, but it's actually quite rare, I hope. And so around the age of 24, 25, I became my own master, so to speak, and I did so by actually not doing anything at all for several years. And because I had, as so many painters today, in fact most, my imaginary world was mainly dependent on photography. I had actually gathered a lot of material by that time. And in that material was a lot of architectural photography. And still up to this day, I don't know exactly why that is. But I do have something with buildings being photographed right after they have been inaugurated, or when they sort of still represent the youth of a way of thinking in an architect. And photography is magical in that sense that it shows you that, this originality, it shows you that even half a century later in its sort of unspoiled state through the meaning of photography. And the thing that has really changed by that time is, of course, your own awareness of what has happened since then. And I think that's part of the magic of photography, that you sort of you know better, but it's still there somehow. And this is what fascinated me with photography from the beginning. But I had never actually had a camera in my hands. So I was mainly, all my thinking happened via pictures that had been taken by other people. And although today I know how to handle a camera, I have more than 50 cameras by now, I still don't consider myself a photographer. I'd be much easier as a sort of philosopher thinking about a picture that I'd find somewhere, or it could be on the internet or anywhere, in fact. And it usually I find it when I'm not looking for it. And of course, when I know that I don't have to look for it, then I try not to look for it, and then I will surely not find it. So it's always a sort of game of hide and seek with the perfect picture that gives you a signal of what the next piece could be. So that's essentially how I work. And I will start by a work called Bordeaux Peace, which I produced during the summer of 2004. But I thought it out in the winter of 2003. And I'm starting with this work because it kind of explicitly relates to architecture. But in the same time, it's also the story of a sort of incidental or accidental encounter with a house. And the house that I came upon was a house by Rem Koolhaas. I think it's one of his best-known private villas in France, in Bordeaux. And I was invited by the owner of the house, whom I'd met on a dinner at the Collector's Place in Brussels. And she said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm an artist, I work with film." And she said, "Well, I have a house by a very famous architect, and you know it?" I said, "No, I don't know it." I saw her looking at me. And I'd already done my speech about architecture by that time, and she said, "Okay, so he doesn't know it." And so the week after that, I went to visit her. And, well, I'm kind of keen on new adventures, so on things that I don't know. And it was in autumn light that I visited this house, and I was kind of critical at the moment when I went in there, because I saw, as a place that's only 8 years in age, how crumbling down it came already. And I thought, bad engineering, probably fancy, but you get tired of it after a while. And but I stayed, I think, 1.5 days, and long enough to appreciate the sunlight that comes in and around the house, and the way it articulates the whole space and actually gives, creates different, really different rooms depending on the time of day. And when I noticed this kind of came together with an idea that I was running in my head at the time, which was something else that I'm very suspicious of. So I'm not so suspicious of architects, but I'm mainly suspicious of filmmakers, cinema, and the way cinema dictates much of what we do and the way we think. This is mainly my the thing that worries me most sometimes. And I had this vengeance piece in my head, which was a short film that would appear like a piece of cinema with 2 or 3 actors, and that was actually playing against the backdrop. It could be any backdrop, but the backdrop had to be an articulation of the movement of the day, the passing of the day, on this location. And being sort of impressionist in mind at that time, and really adoring light and light changes, and being able to sit a whole day to observe, I thought, well, maybe I might apply this idea to this house. And so I started, I visited the place, the house in Bordeaux, several times, studying the light and the way the light moves around the house. And maybe you might know that the house was initially designed for somebody who had lost his mobility, somebody who was in a wheelchair. And so light is a sort of spectacle of the world around him. And it had to, it was actually what had to work like a film. I could feel that there was a cinematic intention in the way the place was built. It had to be spectacular at any moment of the day for the people who live there. And so I came up with this short story of 3 people, and the short story would last for about 10 minutes. And I actually didn't care about what was being said or what happens. But the short story for me was like a kind of foreground event, something that happens right in your face. It's the first thing you see when you switch on television or you go to a movie. You see people, blah, 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 talking. And there's this kind of psychological realism going on, which we so despise. And I use that as a kind of foreground. The background became these compositions, which I had by then figured out in and around the house, where the time of day is articulated as at its best. Ideally, of course, in wintertime, because the sun is lower and creates the sort of more richer palette of colors and shadows. And but of course, wintertime is a bit hard, and the weather very unpredictable, which is what I thought. So I decided to shoot it in summer. Big mistake. Summer at the Atlantic coast can be as unstable as winter. And you can read there that the film lasts about 13 hours and 43 minutes, which is a bit hard to ask for anybody to sit out. But it kind of keeps that in mind, I think, in the sense that it's about, if I forgot exactly, but I think it's around 70 short films that last each around 10 minutes. They're all a little bit different in length. But what they have, what's essential is that the actors, the 3 actors in the piece, reenact every line every scene, each 10 minutes later in the day. So they just perform the same thing, the same words, the same kiss, the same despise, but 10 minutes later in the day. So they don't actually are aware of that themselves, but I imagine the actors must have felt secondary when they were doing so, because they were doing nothing else than a marathon of acting, repeating and repeating and repeating. So there was no sleep, no rest, no breaks. Every 10 minutes we were shooting another scene. And in that sense, light and form dictated everything. So there are a few stills here which I put together like this in order to illustrate the scenario. It starts with a man. He's a film producer, and he's on the phone, and he explains to his girlfriend that he needs to go off to Berlin, and that he wants to have a naked woman in the picture because naked women represent good money. Second is the lover of the girl, so obviously they both have an affair, who's the son of the father, just to make things a little bit complicated, you know, and of course cheaper. And the son calls up the girl, and she pretends she is in another place. She doesn't know he's walking towards her, and she's asking, "Where are you?" And he's asking, "Where are you?" And at one point he realizes she's there with his father. So he's kind of crossed, and they don't say much, but the whole conversation is meant to be avoiding, in fact. It's meant to be just bringing you to the next composition. And so it's kind of lazy and boring in a way. And you can see that composition and light dictates everything from these few stills. And then it goes on. He goes up and talks to his father on the first floor and has an argument. And the father gives him an envelope and says, he actually throws it right in front of him so that he has to grab it as a sort of intimidation effect. And then the father goes off. And that's more or less the end of the film. It ends with where it begins, a view over the city of the river Garonne in Bordeaux. And this film is then, when it finishes, it's of course turned in real time, recorded in real time, so the whole scene lasts 10 minutes, and then of course they have to start immediately with a new film. And maybe it's a little bit, I'm not sure if I should show you, well, I might, but I think I'm going to show you an illustration of what the result is when, oh yeah, these are the stills again. What the result is when you take out 3 seconds of each film and edit them after one another. So I'm not going to show you the piece immediately, but I'm going to show you a sequence of how an actor gets tired in front of a backdrop which is ever changing. So here actually I deploy just my eye as a photographer, and I compose, and Rem Koolhaas himself found it rather uninteresting what I had done. I think because of course I used the publicitary effect of what you can do with the house and with the light, or maybe not so much the light, but mainly I use the transparency of the window walls and then the backdrop. And there's a lot of nature involved. There's a lot of green around it. And there's of course also a lot of birds in the soundtrack. Because the birds were an essential part of the film. The soundtrack was divided in two. It's divided in stuff that you can hear in the headphones and things that you hear through speakers. And the headphones have the music, so soundtrack, of course, it's cinema, and so we need to shed a tear at the end, and it has, of course, the dialogues. And the birds are just actually the witnesses. They were a real-time recording of the birds from morning till evening. So now I show you a 4-second sequence, and just bear with me for a few minutes.
No money. I am leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Me? I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. You call me. I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. You call me. I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour.
It's around 6 in the morning.
You call me. I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What, me? I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Me? Well, I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Yes. Me? I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Me? I'm leaving in half an hour for Berlin. Yeah. Now you call me. I'm leaving for Berlin in half an hour. Yeah. What? Me? I'm leaving
You
for
can
Berlin.
see the light
hour.
progressing from left to right.
You call me. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Yes. What? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Yeah. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Yes. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. Yes. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? Yeah, I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. No. What? Me? I'm leaving for Berlin. Half an hour. What? Me? I'm going off to Berlin.
So this illustrates my sweet revenge on cinema and on actors. And I have to say, the people involved were, of course, very generous because. But I remember that Josse de Pauw, who's the actor and who actually also helped me, or actually he wrote the dialogues, said at the end of the first day, he said, "David, this is the way to kill an actor." You know, it's this repetitive, this sort of, it's a kind of, I'm thinking. Of course, I work with digital media, and this is, I'm really fond on them. I never was a big fan of working with analog. My dream was always to scan my entire archive and to have everything digital. But still, this is a sort of analog revenge as much as you can have it on. And so, of course, the work goes on, and obviously it's never shown in its ideal situation in museums or galleries, because the prettiest moments are the morning and the evening. The galleries is never open on these days, so it's like the story just goes on there. And I'll show you a few production pictures. I work usually with a very small crew. I work on a budget, of course, and this is the advantage of not having been trained the religion of cinema, is that you can sort of do everything. You do it a little bit less good, but you do it anyway. And I work with a small crew also on this production. We were just, we did, each of us had 2 jobs at least. I was cameraman, for example, director as well, and probably the cleaning lady sometimes as well. And the actor was actually sound guy too. And it's basically, we spent a bit more than a month on location, and then another 2 weeks preparing on location. And here, Josse de Pauw comes out of his room. He was writing a novel at the time. And I'd promised him peace and quiet. And of course, that was not really what happened. But he nevertheless did it. And here he's on one of the walls, which we had to double in size because he's afraid of heights and it's a little bit risky otherwise. This is the opening. This is where you come in, the gate. And there were long stretches of pause as well, because in some shots there was shadow or shade because of the clouds, and that meant that this would not be in sync with the sun. And so you can't have one shot in the clouds and the next one will go into the sun. So this had to be radically a sunny picture. And so we had to redo some of the shoots, and this took us another sort of 2 weeks to assemble the puzzle of everything. And quite amusing in the end, the last shot, I'd said we filmed from sunrise until sunset, and plus one scene with the lights on. And the lights on is of course an homage to the crew, because the entire crew, as it is a house with a lot of windows, and at night the crew becomes very reflected as the actors. So the last one is a little bit about how it's all done. But nobody ever gets to see it, of course. Long stretches of pause. And to make things a little bit worse, I did another film with the same principle a year later, but then during winter, almost on the same location. This is actor being tired. This is me waiting for sun. And then the video excerpts, but I think, if I have the time later, I can go into those, maybe show one. But I'd like to go on to another work, which I've done rather recently. Parvenu talked about it a moment ago. It's Sections of a Happy Moment. And it's a very different piece. This must be... I sometimes work in series which will be small series because the production is rather extensive. I'm really very impatient, but you wouldn't think from the stuff that I do, but I really am. And another proof of that is Sections of a Happy Moment, which I completed in 2007, but I started it about 1.5 years earlier. And it's a single channel installation, one could say, which is 25 minutes and 57 seconds, and it's black and white, and it's set in a building complex by a Belgian architect named Renat Bram. He is probably the most important exponent of Belgian modernism. Everybody hates his buildings in Belgium nowadays, of course, but they are in the process of renovating the place, and it actually really looks good. And I used this setting because I was looking for something entirely different, and it was the only place that was close to my studio. I don't like to go out far if I don't have to. It was the only place that was close to my studio and that really represented or embodied the modern spirit of social housing in a way that I was looking for. And in the idea, so I have to say maybe a little bit more about the concept of the piece. A few things came together. I was thinking about China, essentially, when I started with the piece. And I was thinking about a duality, which comes back often in my work, between intimacy and observation, between those things for which you are so close to your nearest, that they could not be sort of captured by observation or how you say it, closed circuit camera, CCTV, and that they could not be captured by a controlling organism. This was mainly what was in my head. And this tension between the very small, those very intimate, and the very large, let's say the sort of state organ that controls and distributes everything, was the starting point. And so these two things which do not really, which are kind of feeling compatible, are often things that get me going for a piece. And I like to bring them together on a seemingly conflictless surface. And here you can see the installation. I think this must have been in Vancouver or at the Centre Pompidou, I'm not sure, installed in the right with another piece called The Stack, which I had made now 13 years ago. And this is another installation view. This is in Vancouver, so it varies in size, but the grander it can be projected, the better. These are a few stills, of which there are in a total about 180 photographs of a single moment in time. And I like that as a spectator, you get the message, or at least one part of the message, rather quickly. And that is, this is a construct. This is not sort of what I always say, the mutual authentication between the camera and the thing that happened. It can't be, it could never have happened. You could not possibly have had 180 pictures being taken at the same moment. So, I mean, later I did, in the series that I did later, I did each time more than 500 stills of the same moment. So it became even more elaborate than this. And technically, the piece, I mean, has its shortcomings, but it does the job in sort of exhausting how much you can do composition-wise with the location and with a simple situation. And the situation is a boy and a girl playing with a ball and surrounded by their parents and grandparents, and a few people who are onlookers standing by. And because the film goes on and on during almost 26 minutes, there is of course a sense of continuity that settles in, despite the fragmentation that you feel inside of you because you read photography. But because it's a film, or maybe you could say a digital slideshow, plus there is a soundtrack, it is also inscribed into some kind of ongoing thing. So that is another duality between the still and the thing that progresses in time. And by doing so, the objects, I call them objects, but they're in fact people, change their statute. They change from people being photographed in a moment in time to objects that more resemble sculptures, that more resemble parts of the architecture in a way, parts of the static thing, parts of the surrounding. And as such, they change the kind of feeling of material. And this was what I was interested in, that they would no longer be people of flesh and blood, but maybe become people like the building, or objects like the building. And somehow architecture really gets me going when it comes to photographing. I love shooting and trying to put myself in the architect's brain and see realize sometimes how amazing it must have been at the time, 60, 70 years ago, to plan a building that and have all these virtual spaces in your head, not with the tools that exist today. And so I think I'm going to show you a small excerpt of the video. so it's just a short piece. The soundtrack is some kind of bottleneck, and sometimes it happens that you're editing late at night and some music is on. And I'm kind of keen on generic music, or music, elevator music as they say, because it pretends to be something it's not. It's sort of a weaker version of music. And it doesn't have high or lows, it doesn't have climaxes really, it just goes on forever. But what it does, and that's the most important, it does its job as being representing a continuity. The opposite of what photography would be, a freeze of a moment. And so that's for sections of a happy moment, essentially, maybe a few more pictures of the way I have made the work. And I said in the beginning I often use triggers to give me ideas, and this is the picture which gave me the idea. It's something I'd found, I don't know, I guess in the library. And initially the piece was called Rope Skipping. It was going to be like this. But then I felt that the girl being lifted up from the ground just represents too much the index of, as an index of proof of movement. And it kind of breaks the laziness that I wanted to have in the whole setup. So I transferred that to the ball. The ball is then is the only object that's actually floating, plus the two elderly people, which are never allowed to sit down in their chair. They're always busy moving. And I've done this kind of small little things in other works as well. And then a few pictures of the archive, which come from the archive of Renat Braam, so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to show them or whatever. But this is early on when the complex was finished. It's actually really magnificent. It feels very light and very still today. But it's of course now filled up with urban sprawl, full of little individual houses, which is which gives you a real sense of what people actually think about it. They never attempted to reproduce this kind of housing in the neighborhood ever again. And then these are some stills, so I studied all this, and of course the light, the moment when the light again is very important. And then of course I always make sketches. This was here still with the idea of doing something sportive, and then that quickly progressed to the rope skipping, and then the situation sketches of very concretely already. This is these drawings, I made them when I knew already exactly what the piece was going to be like. And drawing is about the only thing that I retained from my sort of academic training. I'm far too good painter to still paint. And then this is the studio. At that time it was I just moved into a new studio, and so it was all kind of primitive. We were just helping ourselves with whatever we could use. And more drawings. And then some screenshots. Here you can see that the scenario still looked rather different. This was still with the girl being suspended in the air. And then here we already have the compositions ready. There was a lot of cleaning, digital cleaning, in the sense that you have the trees that once upon a time the architect probably had planted as young trees and become adult trees. Now of course they were age-old trees, and because I wanted to restore the place digitally to its original state, that meant photoshopping out each and every leaf on a tree and replacing them with young ones. This is Photoshop compositions, or actually it's After Effects, and all sort of things. So that's for arena. I would now like to move on to another piece which I'm picking out the works that have some kind of relation with architecture. Either they're set in architecture or I'm just inspired by it. And that piece is called Sunrise, and it was in my the show that I had at Parasol Unit here a few months ago. Plus, it was also, I think, included in my gallery show at Hauser and Weert at Piccadilly Circus in 2009. And this work is an old idea for which it took me a long time to find a location to film it. And 5 years to be precise. And sometimes one has to be patient. And the idea came actually together with at the time when I did Bordeaux piece, but I said to myself, I cannot possibly shoot two different concepts in a single building. That would be too much of an homage to Rem Koolhaas. And so I was looking for something else. And at one day I found a book in the library on it was private architecture in England, I think it was. And then there's an architect named Graham Phillips, who I'm not sure if he's still, but he used to be the associé of Norman Foster. And he had built this wonderful house for himself, privately, called Skywood House. And it's west of London in a small town, small village called Denham. And what's so curious sometimes with really beautiful places is that, and the museums have that too. And I think it's not the only thing that they have in common, contemporary architecture and museums, is that they don't take into account the sound situation. Denham, the house in Denham, is located 100 meters away from an airport. So you have from 7 o'clock in the morning, you have airplanes going up and there's a helicopter training base. And the house in Bordeaux is located on a hill, and if you go down the hill, there's a highway passing by. So depending on the wind, you either sleep quietly at night or you don't sleep at all. So is this, and I'm kind of amused with how a theatrical this seems to have as an implication, that the sound seems to be kind of secondary with the way you can picture the location, and the picturesque is therefore much more dominant. And so maybe another word about Sunrise, as the main idea here too was a duality between the modern and the romantic. And I mean that both sophisticated, but also very simple, very general. They're both parts of our history from which by now we think we know much more. And we are we're cleverer than modernism, and we're also cleverer than romanticism. So they kind of both represent ongoing phenomena in our culture over which we have some kind of power, at least historically it's been written down. And I wanted to play these two phenomena out against one another. My belief is that we're still working very much, of course, with the remains. Well, they're actually not even remains, they're just active components of our culture. But at the same time, they're also museal in a way. They're kind of dug away when we want them. And therefore I conceived the work, the film, in two chapters, a very dark part and a very light part. And the dark part is the whole first part of the film, which I show you some stills of here. And the idea of the work is that it's so pitch black that your eyes need to adapt to the darkness when you enter into the cinema or when you enter into the place where it's installed. So the walls are painted pitch black, and the projection also happens directly on the black walls in order to create a light which is very feeble, as if the whole situation resembles a little bit like a room in a museum full of fragile drawings that are about to fall apart, which are very dimly lit out. This was the idea. But in the film, which is not much more than a choreography of a cleaning lady doing the household for wealthy people who can afford to live minimal and surrounded by nature, by choreographing her movements in such a way that she is beautifully imprisoned. It's not at all about her. It's about what the camera does with the house and how it flirts with the way it's framing the house. And I consider this work a little bit like the epitome of what I've done with, or my attraction to architectural photography, which is all about symmetry and trying to find things that, you wouldn't usually see so easily, but with the camera you do. And the subject of the work, as I said, is about this cleaning lady, but she works in utter darkness. There is no light, except for a moment when, by the way, all these pictures are largely overexposed, except for a moment when the owner of the house goes to the loo and switches on the light briefly and then switches it off again. And so this is a little bit a funny thing in the work, that your eyes adapt and she's just doing her job in the middle of the night. She's bringing in the wood. Here the owner goes to the toilet. Then she's cleaning the windows inside and out, and here I play with the mirroring effect, of course, of light on glass and the transparency. Here she's on the inside, there she's on the outside. You both have her reflections. And finally there's a shot on the outside which goes over a lake which lies in front of the, or a pond actually, which lies in front of the house. And just to give you an illustration of how theatrical the whole house has been conceived, the pond is not just water on the soil, it's actually a pitch black foil which is stretched over on the bottom of the pond, which makes the water looks pitch black. The house itself is very white, which of course the weather, the climate in England doesn't really allow for the white to stay very long. It becomes green with moss and starts to deteriorate quite quickly. But the architect had found a solution for that. He had made a slight inclination on top of the walls, which meant that the rain would always go down on one particular side. So he would have the walls painted white once a year on one side, and every second year, if I remember, on both sides. So in order to save some work, and there's a lot of square meters of white wall there. And here my maid gets a break. She lights up a cigarette, and there's another occasion to just frame her in front of a house, in front of white plains and darkness. And this is then more or less the end, where she brings out the garbage, still neatly composed. And all of this is not filmed with high quality equipment. This is just filmed with, proper amateur equipment. And a good cameraman and some good guys just having a lot of fun for a week. And so after she dropped the garbage, she does the final arrangements in the house, makes the coffee, puts the table, waits for the coffee to be ready, and then goes out. And that's the end of the film, where actually the second chapter, the romantic part, starts. That's the beginning of her day, coincides with the ending of her work day. So it's kind of free time at the end of the movie. And I think the second feeling that I had in me with what I wanted to do with the work was to create conflicting sentiments about what is the beginning and what is the end. And as such, this goes back to, it links back to the modern and the romantic, which is actually having the say at the moment, or which is the beginning and which is the end. And this also coincides with a beautiful piece of Rachmaninoff music, which just lasts very shortly for, I think, 50 seconds. And she just drives into the sunlight away to her village. And basically that's it. So it's essentially a quiet movie where you might want to fall asleep. And at the end, a wake-up call, and it's Rachmaninoff. But what it does ultimately, it delivers a sensation, I hope, I think, of something which is not entirely resolved, something for which no sides have been taken, and for which actually you don't know which is the dominant factor really in the film. And that's what's important, is that you don't choose sides, is that you let the two fighting factors speak with one another while not saying a thing at all. I'm very keen on that. A few images of how I came to find the house in Denham. I searched about everything, both historical modernism and contemporary architecture. And Dessau, I don't know where that is. I think that's Spain. No, that's, I think this is in Czechia. And then ultimately I found Denham, a place which is by nature very theatrical, as you can see, in the way it's built. It was often used for commercials and for films, naturally. So it kind of, for me, it represented the ideal spot. It was, on one hand, referring to Mies van der Rohe and to modernism, and on the other hand, it was a remake of that, with almost more obsession than the real thing. But I learned a lot from living for a while in both places. It was very interesting to see how cinematic an experience it can be if you are invited in this special, spectacular houses, and you stay there for a while, and you can see differences in depth in already alone the location, of course. England, the weather is different, the light is different, it's much more capricious. You have 3 different seasons in a day, etc. In Bordeaux, the light is very different. And then again, the storyboard is, of course, as in Bordeaux piece, it's mainly a pretext for the camera work. And these are the production stills on location. We prepared most of the shots during the day and filmed at night. But some of the shots had, of course, the windows and such reflections that we sometimes were forced to shoot during the day or during dusk. This is at night. One of the last shots. Again with a very small crew. It was freezing cold and the heating was broken. That's my crew, so it's very small. Me playing the guy who opens the door. And of course the use of these lengthy track shots, which if you combine them with tele, it's a very interesting. And this was the cover of my latest book. So I would now go on to the work that that's in progress, to which I'm working right now, and it's a very, very different story again. Since a few years, I have, well, being encouraged by the people I work with, my assistants, who are all artists and self-taught geniuses, and to go over to another way of working and slowly introducing computer-generated or CGI imagery. And when we think of computer-generated imagery, we often think of automation in photography, but that's quite the opposite. It's very laborious. And while photography still confronts you to a world into which you have to intervene, CGI means that you have to invent everything from scratch. So it questions your sort of capacity as a filmmaker or as a photographer to imagine the existing world. And there the problems start, of course, because the first thing you do is you fall into cliches. Nothing you will create actually exists. You make everything from scratch. And fortunately, sometimes I do have very concrete ideas. And this piece has just been finished. It's the oil workers, it's a long title, oil workers of the Shell Company of Nigeria returning home from work caught up in rain. And it's an animation, and the duration is not specified because it's an infinite loop. The title is important because it kind of poisons the image. It's about oil. It's about oil and about Shell. And of course also about water, because they are caught up in rain. And I started from a picture that I'd found, again somewhere, I don't know exactly where I would have to trace it back, but it just arrived in my archive. And since a number of years I wanted to do something about the idea of the African continent and how its state is. And by that I mean how photography is in fact in a miserable situation there, because photographers always come back with the same cliches of poverty, drought, misery, war, and conflict. And I didn't want to embark on that. And of course rain sort of provides the ideal opening up for a narrative which creates a tension between the oily, sticky surface and the water or humidity. So I started studying the relations between water and oil in photography. And the first pictures were quite clear, but here it becomes less obvious which is oil and which is water. And so this fascinates me. A moment ago I was speaking about Impressionism, but actually what materials do to you, even in a virtual environment like the internet or like digital photography or digital film, is they do actually send very concrete messages. Oil, water, reflection, things like that, light, these are very sort of sensorial memories. And I kind of like to work with those. And so I started making an animation very roughly. We call that a clay model of figures on their motorbikes and then a few figures in the background to see which movement might work for the piece. This is, of course, looks ridicule, but it gives an idea of the speed and whether the project is at all worth embarking upon or not. Then to go on, I built in my studio a big scanner. I call it a scanner, but it's actually not a scanner. It's just a group of cameras, 25 to be precise, which are all synchronized and they shoot at the same moment. It's a lot of photographic material to work with, but what I do with it afterwards is all this photographic source material is being fed to a computer and to a program which makes out of it a 3D model. So here you can see one of my, we call them oil workers, it's a little bit disrespectful, but it's one of the figurants that pose one by one. And this is then a resulting figure already with the textures on him, but he's still lifeless. There's no animation in the eyes. The skin looks dead, it looks mummified somehow. And this is then a quick animation of one of the guys on the motorbike. It still looks, as you can see, and I'm fascinated up to this moment, I don't know yet how to explain, but there's a very concrete, tactile side to CGI. Everything always feels like some kind of material, because you don't have a reference for it. So in this case, it feels like rubber maybe, or something painted. And then here it starts feeling like something shiny, but not yet complete. And these are then the first figures inserted into the picture. More, until it becomes sort of populated. And this is the resulting work, which will be not such a small picture, but which will be gigantic high definition projection. This is also super compressed. So it's a little bit contrary to what I'm preaching about materials here. the movement of the camera slowly moves towards a still portrait, which remains like that for a minute, after which the camera continues its sort of elliptical movement. And if you try to imagine the space, it's rather impossible because the figures reappear on both sides of the road. So there are, if you stay a while, you get a sense that they're going in no direction and could not possibly go in no direction because they're twice the same figures, they're always repeating. But what you miss here, of course, in this compressed version is the eyes and the expressions. I tend to show this on the size which is at least almost 4 meters height, so that you get about 5 meters wide, or almost 6 meters wide. And a more or less life-size dimension. I think the last piece that I would like to say something about is another work which is entirely not finished at all, but which is my oldest idea ever. I had it in 1994, and I always avoided making it because it had a component in it which was very annoying. It's based on a piece of music that I once heard, and it's relaxation music. So there I go again with the generic soundtracks, and it's music that's been written for people in hospitals or in saunas or elevators or whatever, or just to make you fall asleep. And but I so much like the idea of, and always had, of the idea as a place of the museum as a place where you could sleep, where you can take a nap, and where it's relatively quiet. And so actually 1996 to 2013. It's not 1994. So it was a long time in the making, mainly because I didn't find the location where I wanted to shoot it. And I was also a little bit embarrassed about the music because it might mean the end of my career somehow. But then last year I did buy the rights of the music, and the author of the music was rather surprised. He thought everybody had forgotten about him, and he embarked upon a career as a contemporary composer and really wants to have nothing to do with what he did in his former life. And so it was a little bit odd because I wrote him a long letter about how great his soundtrack was. And in fact it is. The quality of the soundtrack is that so what does relaxation music? It does nothing else than to move you in different states, different mental spaces, no? It brings you from light to dark, and then it wakes you up again at the end. It becomes light because you should wake up. You shouldn't eternally be asleep with the music. So, and he had written music like this, you know, to make you have a power nap with some aid. And the piece of music is about 12 minutes in length, and it's called Relaxation Profonde in French, which is clear. And it starts with this kind of sunny, summery tune. And I imagined it's somewhere in a park in the woods, with a bench and with a small tree and nice weather, but maybe evening light. And it goes in a forest. It starts with a forest, which is just the woods in the park, but soon after that they become more profound and dark and deeper. And of course the music goes to kind of system where it is just a drone, just, and obviously you have to fall asleep. And I'm counting that there will be a lot of people offended by that fact that by this how can I serve exquisite people such vulgar music. But I'm convinced that you can actually do it with anything, as long as the images associated with it are right. And as such, the camera moves on deeper into the forest, passes by a small river. The river, as maybe you can imagine what that might be, the sound of the river means slowly waking up. Then there's a triangle sound, that means now you wake up. And then there is even a lake in the middle, it's really very deep, and a valley. And at the end, the camera goes out of the forest again, but by then you have, space-wise, you have the imagination in your head that you've been in a big forest with monumental trees. There's a lot of architectural references again in there. It's a work about the different measures and how you can actually put them on their heads, if you want. And the music does so, and actually I just created the images for the music. And in the end, the camera goes out and the music sort of, in a kind of epiphanic mood, goes broader and bigger. And yes, this was good, I'm awake again and can go on with my day. And it goes kind of upwards. The image literally does so too. It comes out of the forest and in a helicopter shot, we call it a helicopter shot, moves out of the forest and moves up about 200 meters above the earth. And it reveals the forest in its entirety. But what you see is that in the end, the forest reveals to be just a small bush. A group of 50 to 100 trees that have no significance whatsoever and that just are surrounded by by roads and by villages and by things that I imagine it's somewhere set in Flanders or north of France or maybe England, but England is a little bit too picturesque for it. Should be boring. So it's both a upgoing movement and a movement that actually brings you down, and this is what it's about. And because I couldn't find a proper location for real, and it didn't suit sort of my imagination, I started to do this in 3D as well. And here you can see some early movement studies, again in the clay model, of the deepest part of the film. Well, it looks like snow, but it's going to be very dark. And these are hour-long discussions about how to design, how to build a location like that, and that's the great part for me, is that it really brings out all your sort of pictorial background you needed in order to build something. And of course also you very quickly are confronted with your own limitations in imagination. Basically, it was on the wall in the Manet show today again, where he says he doesn't have any imagination. And that's true, you only have, your imagination is something that works based upon the things that you are seeing and living with. And then these are some stills of the more elaborate version. I think it's not entirely photographic, it will always be kind of generic. But the real reason why I didn't film it on location is because forests are always very specific. The trees are either from there or from there, or and I think I really like studio work so much that and the control over the light and the sun and everything, that I preferred actually to make it the generic forest as well, in order to sync better with the music. And this is the point where the camera goes in. I can't show you the film because it's not ready. It takes about estimated 7 months to calculate in the computer, day and night. And this is then a preliminary shot of a very deep scene, but as you can see, it's very light and it's not going to be like that. It's going to be a bit darker. And this is supposed to give you a sense of a deep valley somewhere inside the forest with a path, stairs moving down. And you have to imagine that this is all animation, this is all moving forward camera. So it's like this camera that floats very eerie without the camera operator. And then this is the completed picture of the clay model that I showed you a moment ago. But again, also there we'll pull down the lights, it won't be so bright. And then the next scene is what I call the cathedral scene. It's just a lonely tree, abandoned tree in the middle of a forest, surrounded by huge scenes. Sorry, I should stop. Trees. And then a river, small river, just a creek. Here it's not yet filled with water. We first built the entire riverbed and then literally have the water flowing into it. And this is the clay model of the river scene. This is how it begins. I actually love these most. And then a silicone animation of water. These are millions of polygons. That takes forever to film that. And then this is the sort of resulting effect of it. This is all calculated by a computer. And these are, it's really like opening up a tab. So what you do with CGI is you're both busy with architecture because you have to build up everything from the ground, but also with the basic natural phenomena. The light can't be tricked. You have to be aware of it. You have to... it is such a craft that is... I truly believe that pictorially it's far more complicated than anything the Van Eyck brothers ever did. But of course, what nobody knows to do in people who are skilled painters or draftsmen in CGI, they don't have the time to enjoy the art. So they're always busy producing something, and this is why you never have, or rarely have, great artists in that domain. You have good craftsmen, but you have... So that's for travel. So and this work will premiere at the Moscow Biennial of this year, and Oil Workers will premiere at the Georgia Biennial of this year. And that's what I'm working on. I think maybe I should give, if anybody has questions, shoot ahead, please. Thank you.
Are there questions?
Okay, I understand it.
How do you feel about parallax? Because it seems to be an awful lot of your concern centers on the very simple phenomenon of two things passing at slightly different speeds, and at one point eclipsing or occluding and then coming past. And this seems to be a sort of crucial phenomenon that triggers the effect, as it were.
It's interesting the way you describe it, of course, as a parallax, is that they don't conflict. They generate a third presence. And I've always, but actually it's more accurate than what I'm always saying, as them being a duality, two things which were not supposed to live together and then do in the end, and you see what comes out of that. But that's, of course, I think really the energy that I'm hoping for comes out of two non-conflicting worlds brought together, and the non-conflict is essential. because I always sort of imagine that what we're trained with is that energy comes from burning in one way or another. It comes from you gain energy by wasting it at the same time, or by conflicting. Like, imagine the combustion engine, the petrol engine and the internal combustion engine. There's always war going on somehow. When we speak about energy, there's always fighting going on. There's always fire somehow. And more generally, I'm more interested in an energy that's produced in a different manner, not by having the different factions fighting against one another. And this is what I've been trying all the time. Sometimes more literal than others. And there's another work of which I didn't speak at all tonight, which is the Algiers sections of A Happy Moment, where I had a bunch of birds and Maghreb young men and elderly men standing together, which was in fact a reference, but I shouldn't say that, maybe to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and much and I tried to have this resulting in an enduring a picture, not one which starts fighting, but not one in which you have to choose camps, but in which you create a space where something else happens. I'm not very accurate in describing what that would be.
I mean, when you speak about fire, and you also to do with the water flow, it's often said in representations of entropy that you recognize the arrow of time by the direction of dispersal, which is a different kind of motion from the circular parallaxing elliptical looping that you seem to. So that there's a movement which is in the arrow of time and entropic, to do with perhaps the dissipation and burning of energy. But there's another motion which you seem concerned with, which is a sort of orbiting, which simply reveals things in a mobile stillness.
The orbiting provides you, of course, with an option that filmmakers never had. That's the fourth wall is gone. You have actually the entire freedom of movement. You don't have to hide the mechanism that stands behind you as a sort of, which you do when you shoot something. You always have the invisible wall behind you. And with orbiting, it's how shall I say? It's kind of delusioning in a way, or disillusioning, because you reveal that there's no fourth wall. And I'm just beginning right now to sort of discover what I can do with that, what the possibilities of that are, and it's really new to me. Yeah. Yeah, there are two.
Oh, hang on. Hello. Can you describe the process of your piece, which I believe is called The Long Goodbye?
The Long Goodbye.
Yes. And my second question is, can you see your work in following a little bit, I mean, is your work inspired by Chantal Akerman's vision of unfolding the time, and also the kind of lack of hierarchy between the actor and the background being space and architecture?
It should be influenced by Chantal, but it's not. And this is, I don't know, nowadays every generation forgets about the previous in one way or another. But there's another thing. I mean, when I see her work, her early work especially, it's striking, of course. And but she's in another camp or in another league. She's really a filmmaker somehow, and she studied it, and I don't. So I'm always going to be a little bit on the outside of that. And the other thing you were asking about Long Goodbye, I could maybe show you a few things about that. Long Goodbye should be somewhere here. White House, Shadow Piece, no, it must be after that. Yeah, that's Long Goodbye. Long Goodbye is again made out of two speeds that are brought together on the same surface, and one is a extreme slowing down of a motion capture of a woman, and the other is a speeding up of daylight passing on the facade of a house. And yeah, here the film is playing, but it goes from black to black. I will go a little bit further, and I don't know really why I made that piece. I think I made it because of the thing that happens when she at one point waves goodbye. Because both of the whole speed is artificial. It feels, on one hand, it feels very slow. It feels like a slow motion, but at one point it's the balance is gone, and it goes over to a speeding up of time. And before you know, it's pitch black. The evening sets in, and like it's very quick darkness setting in. And this has to do with her noticing your own presence as a spectator. And I think that was probably what made me decide to make this piece, is that she would be aware, a little bit like in Manet, where you have, well, I don't want to compare too much, but where you have the figure being loaded with the consciousness of, this is of course also rhetorics, with the consciousness of somebody looking at her or him. And so where you have a theatrical sense of a figure in a picture. And the awareness is both directions. And this is a rich sort of theme in which I tried to tap in this work. And the way it was made is basically, this is always very disenchanting, I'm afraid. It's a long track, so we emptied the swimming pool for it. We found this house, and I wanted to do something about the garden without showing the garden. And so it's a very beautiful garden with these gigantic trees. And then this is in the studio where I'm shooting the woman. And yeah, these are some. And then basically I photographed one still per second per centimeter. So each second I move 1 centimeter backwards, I regress 1 centimeter backwards, and I take another still. So that was the dogma in the work, the way it was done. So it crosses 50 meters, I think it is, in about 9 hours or so. Yeah, but that's how it's done. Yeah, that's how the work was done. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, it's way past 8 o'clock. I think unless there's a burning question, I think we should thank you and let you rest.
Thank you for coming.